London, 1845. The Gazette lay open on every breakfast table in Mayfair, its scandalous headline gleaming with fresh ink: Duke of Thornfield found incapable at annual ball, society questions fitness to lead ancient house. Richard Thornfield, the 6th Duke of Thornfield, crumpled the paper in his fist, his jaw clenched so tightly that his valet feared for his lordship's teeth. The Duke's shoulders, always rigid with the weight of his title, now seemed to bear the additional burden of public humiliation. "Shall I clear the newspapers away, Your Grace?" Hopkins, the valet, ventured cautiously. "Leave them," the Duke commanded, his voice cold as the marble floors of Thornfield House. "I shall know what they say of me." What they said was vicious, if not entirely untrue. At Lady Harrington's ball 3 nights prior, the Duke had been called upon to lead the opening quadrille with the hostess's daughter. It was a simple enough task for any gentleman of breeding, but the Duke had frozen, stumbled, and ultimately excused himself with such haste that whispers erupted before he'd even quit the ballroom. "His Grace cannot dance," the whispers became shouts in the gossip pages. The Duke of Thornfield, whose ancestors have presided over court dances since the time of Henry VIII, cannot perform a simple quadrille. Richard tossed back his brandy, though the clock had not yet struck noon. This humiliation was merely the latest in a series that had befallen him since inheriting the dukedom from his father a year ago. A man of science and solitude, he had been ill-prepared for the scrutiny of society. His elder brother, groomed since birth for the title, had been carried off by fever, leaving Richard, the scholar, the recluse, the awkward second son, to assume duties he had never wanted nor understood. "Hopkins, cancel my engagements for the month," he said suddenly. "I shall retire to Thornfield Park until this nonsense has faded from memory." "Your Grace," Hopkins cleared his throat, "Lady Harrington's daughter is said to favour your attentions." "Perhaps if you were to call upon her, I shall not subject myself to further ridicule," Richard snapped. "The carriage, Hopkins." "Today." As the elegant coach bearing the Thornfield crest rumbled out of London the following morning, Richard gazed out at the passing countryside with relief. The green hills of Derbyshire would soon replace the grey streets of London, and with them, perhaps, would come some peace from the mockery of the ton. Meanwhile, some 60 miles north of London, Winifred Osborne bent over rows of turnips, her back aching from hours of labour. At 22, she had spent most of her life in the service of others, first as the daughter of a tenant farmer, then as a lady's maid, and now, after her father's death and the family's eviction, as a gardener at Thornfield Park, the Duke's country estate. "Winnie," called Mrs. Thatcher, the housekeeper, hurrying across the kitchen garden with unusual haste for a woman of her substantial proportions. "Wash your hands and change your apron. His Grace arrives within the hour, and we've had no warning." Winnie straightened, pushing a stray chestnut curl back under her cap. "The Duke? Coming here?" "But the house has been closed for years." "Well, it's open now," Mrs. Thatcher said grimly. "Hopkins sent word ahead by messenger not an hour ago. His Grace means to stay indefinitely. Heaven help us all." Rumours of the Duke's character had reached even the servants at Thornfield Park. Cold, they said. Arrogant. Demanding. A man who preferred his books and scientific instruments to people. Winnie had never laid eyes on him, though she had worked at the estate for 2 years now. The previous Duke had been a frequent visitor, beloved by the staff for his jovial nature and generous spirit. His second son was said to be quite different. By the time the ducal carriage arrived, the house was in a flurry of activity. Winnie had been reassigned from the gardens to help the understaffed household prepare guest chambers that had not been aired in a decade. She was beating dust from a tapestry when she heard the unmistakable sound of carriage wheels on gravel. Curiosity drew her to the window. Below, a tall figure emerged from the coach, broad-shouldered, straight-backed, with hair the colour of burnished copper in the afternoon sun. The Duke of Thornfield had arrived. What Winnie could not see from her vantage point was the tightness around the Duke's eyes, the weariness in his step as he entered his ancestral home. Richard Thornfield had fled London to escape his failings, only to be confronted with more of them. Thornfield Park, once his brother's domain, was as foreign to him as the ballrooms of Mayfair. "Welcome home, Your Grace," said Mrs. Thatcher with a curtsy that belied her advancing years. "Thank you," Richard replied stiffly. "I require only a light supper and privacy. I shall take my meals in the library." "As you wish, Your Grace." Mrs. Thatcher hesitated. "Will there be guests joining you during your stay?" "Certainly not," Richard said sharply. "I have come here for solitude, Mrs. Thatcher. See that I am not disturbed." For 2 weeks, the Duke kept to his word. He emerged from the library only for solitary rides across his vast estate, returning with mudded boots and a countenance as forbidding as the gathering autumn storms. The servants whispered that he spent his nights pacing, that candles burned until dawn in the library windows. Some said he was going mad, like his grandfather. Others claimed he nursed a broken heart. Only Winnie, assigned to tend the small indoor conservatory adjoining the library, glimpsed another side of him. Through the glass partition between the 2 rooms, she sometimes saw him seated at his desk, head in his hands, shoulders slumped, not in arrogance, but in something that looked remarkably like defeat. On the 15th day of the Duke's residence, Winnie was pruning a recalcitrant orange tree when she heard it, music, faint and halting, coming from the library. Curious, she moved closer to the glass door separating the 2 rooms, careful to remain hidden behind a potted palm. The Duke stood in the center of the library, attempting, with evident frustration, to practice dance steps. A small music box played a tinny waltz as he counted under his breath, 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. His movements were stiff, his timing erratic. After several minutes of increasingly agitated attempts, he kicked over a footstool and swore with a vehemence that made Winnie's eyes widen. "Impossible," she heard him mutter. "Utterly impossible." The following day, Winnie was summoned to the housekeeper's office. Mrs. Thatcher looked grim. "His Grace has complained about the state of the conservatory," she said. "Apparently, there was dirt on the floor yesterday evening when he went to examine the plants." "I'm sorry, Mrs. Thatcher," Winnie said, though she was certain she had swept before leaving. "It won't happen again. See that it doesn't. The Duke has taken an interest in the exotic specimens there. He may visit at any time." That afternoon, Winnie was more careful than ever, sweeping twice and making sure every leaf was in perfect order. She was just finishing when the connecting door from the library opened. The Duke stood framed in the doorway, taller than she had imagined, his green eyes sharp beneath a furrowed brow. Winnie dropped into a curtsy so hasty she nearly toppled over. "Your Grace," she murmured, keeping her eyes lowered. Richard Thornfield studied the girl before him, slender, brown-haired, dressed in the plain garb of a servant, yet holding herself with a quiet dignity. "You maintain the conservatory?" he asked. "Yes, Your Grace. The orchids are flourishing. I had expected them to have perished years ago." Winnie dared to look up. The Duke's face was not unkind, merely guarded. "I've studied their care, Your Grace. Your mother's journals were most instructive." A flicker of surprise crossed his features. "You can read?" "My father ensured I had some education, Your Grace. Before he died." Richard nodded, then turned as if to leave. At the door, he paused. "What is your name?" "Winifred Osborne, Your Grace." "Winnie, they call me." "Well, Miss Osborne, continue your good work." The door closed behind him, and Winnie released the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The encounter might have been the end of it, had fate not intervened. 3 days later, Winnie was working late in the conservatory, having stayed to tend to a particularly delicate bloom that had begun to droop. The house was quiet, the other servants retired to their quarters, when she heard the music box again. Through the glass partition, she saw the Duke, once more attempting to master the basic steps of a waltz. Once more failing. Once more cursing in frustration. Without thinking, Winnie tapped lightly on the glass door. The Duke's head snapped up, his expression thunderous. "Who's there?" Winnie pushed the door open a fraction. "It's Winifred, Your Grace." "The gardener." She hesitated. "I couldn't help but notice, that is." I might be able to assist. Assist? His voice was dangerously soft. With what, precisely? With the dancing, Your Grace. Seeing his expression darken further, she hurried on. My father was a dancing master before he lost his position. He taught me everything he knew. Richard stared at her, torn between mortification and intrigue. You presume to teach me to dance. I presume nothing, Your Grace, Winnie said, finding courage she didn't know she possessed. But I do know that you're counting wrong, and your posture is making it impossible to turn properly. For a long moment, the Duke said nothing. Then, to Winnie's astonishment, he laughed, a rusty sound, as if long unused. Do you always speak so frankly to your betters, Miss Osborne? Only when they're struggling with something I can help with, Your Grace. Another silence, this one considering. Finally, Richard gestured to the center of the room. Show me, then. Winnie stepped into the library, suddenly aware of her worn dress, her calloused hands, her hair escaping its pins after a long day's work. But when she demonstrated the basic waltz step, her movements were graceful, assured, and utterly correct. You must think of it as a box, she explained, tracing the pattern on the carpet. And the rhythm is not a 1, 2, 3 as you were counting, but one 2 3, one 2 3. The emphasis changes everything. For an hour, Winnie guided the Duke through the rudiments of the waltz. He was a quick study, his initial awkwardness giving way to increasing confidence as he mastered the basic steps. Better, she said finally, stepping back with a satisfied nod. Much better, Your Grace. Not good enough, Richard said, his jaw set in a determined line. Not for what I need. Winnie tilted her head, curious. And what is that, Your Grace? For a moment, it seemed he might confide in her. Then the ducal mask slipped back into place. That will be all for tonight, Miss Osborne. Thank you for your assistance. Winnie curtsied and returned to the conservatory, certain she had overstepped and would be dismissed in the morning. Instead, when she arrived for work the next day, Mrs. Thatcher informed her that she was to report to the library every evening after dinner. His Grace wishes you to continue maintaining the conservatory during extended hours, the housekeeper said, clearly puzzled. Something about the night-blooming specimens requiring special attention. And so began the strangest period of Winnie's life. By day, she tended the gardens as always. By night, in the secrecy of the Duke's library, she taught him to dance. Richard proved to be an apt pupil once his initial resistance faded. His natural grace, evident in the way he rode, walked, commanded a room, translated well to the dance floor once he understood the mechanics. Within a week, he had mastered the waltz and moved on to the quadrille, the cotillion, and the increasingly complex patterns of the fashionable dances. They spoke little during these lessons, but gradually, the silences between them grew comfortable rather than strained. Occasionally, the Duke would ask about her father, and Winnie would share stories of the man who had once danced before royalty before drink had claimed his career and, eventually, his life. He taught me everything he knew, Winnie said one night, demonstrating a particularly intricate turn. Said I had more talent than his fine London pupils, though of course, no one would hire a farmer's daughter to teach their children. Why did he become a farmer if he was so accomplished? Richard asked, executing the turn with newfound confidence. He fell in love with my mother, Winnie said simply. She was a tenant farmer's daughter. His family disowned him for the marriage. Richard's steps faltered momentarily. And did he regret it? The sacrifice. Winnie shook her head, smiling at the memory. He said the happiest days of his life were spent with my mother, watching me grow. Even when we were poor, even when he had to take work in the fields to survive. Some treasures, he would say, are worth any price. The Duke was silent for a long moment. Then, your father sounds like a wise man. He was, Winnie agreed, suddenly aware of how close they were standing, how the candlelight caught the copper highlights in the Duke's hair. She stepped back, professional once more. Now, shall we try the polonaise? It's quite the rage in London this season. As the lessons continued, Winnie became aware of subtle changes in the Duke. His perpetual frown eased. He occasionally smiled, brief flashes that transformed his severe features. Once, when she tripped over the edge of the carpet, he caught her with surprisingly gentle hands, and for a moment, they stood frozen, his arms around her waist, her hands on his broad shoulders. "Thank you, Your Grace," she had murmured, stepping away with burning cheeks. "Richard," he said suddenly. "I beg your pardon. My name is Richard. When we are here, like this, you may use it." Winnie shook her head, alarmed. "That would be most improper, Your Grace. More improper than a gardener teaching a duke to dance in secret." His lips quirked in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "I think we have moved beyond propriety, Miss Osborne." She could not argue with that logic, though she compromised by calling him my lord instead, less formal than his title, yet still maintaining some semblance of the distance their stations demanded. By the 6th week of their arrangement, Richard had mastered every dance a gentleman might be called upon to perform. The lesson should have ended, yet neither suggested it. "I received a letter from London today," Richard said one evening as they practiced a particularly lively country dance. "Apparently, my extended absence has been noted. There are rumors that I am ill, or worse, that I have fled the country to escape my debts." "Are you in debt, my lord?" Winnie asked, surprised. "Quite the contrary. The Thornfield estates are among the most prosperous in England." He executed a perfect turn. "But gossip requires no factual basis. The tongue simply cannot fathom why a duke would prefer the company of trees and books to their endless, mindless entertainments." "Will you return, then?" "To prove them wrong." Richard's expression grew distant. "I must. The season begins again next month. My absence would be noted." Winnie nodded, ignoring the unexpected pang in her chest at the thought of his departure. "You'll dance beautifully," she said, forcing brightness into her voice. "They'll be amazed at the transformation." "Yes," Richard said, though he seemed distracted. "Winnie, there is a matter I wish to discuss with you." But at that moment, there came a knock at the library door. Richard stepped away from her with practiced swiftness as Hopkins entered. "Forgive the interruption, Your Grace, but Lady Rosalind and her mother have arrived. They await you in the drawing room." Richard's face darkened. "Lady Rosalind? Here?" "Yes, Your Grace. They have come directly from London. Lady Harrington expressed concern for your health and wished to see for herself that you were well." "How thoughtful," Richard said, in a tone that suggested it was anything but. "Inform them I shall join them shortly." When Hopkins had gone, Richard turned to Winnie, his expression unreadable. "You should return to your quarters. We will continue our discussion another time." Winnie curtsied, suddenly acutely aware of the vast gulf between them, a gulf that no amount of dance lessons could bridge. "Of course, my lord. Good night." As she slipped through the servants' passage, Winnie caught a glimpse of the visitors in the drawing room. Lady Rosalind Harrington was everything Winnie was not: elegant, blonde, exquisitely dressed, her delicate hands never having known a day's labor. The perfect duchess. Winnie did not sleep that night. The next morning, the house was abuzz with gossip about the unexpected guests. Lady Harrington and her daughter had been given the finest guest chambers. The Duke had dined with them privately. Lady Rosalind had been heard practicing the pianoforte in the music room, presumably to entertain his grace. Winnie threw herself into her work, ignoring the hollow feeling in her chest. What had she expected? That a few dance lessons would somehow erase the differences in their stations? That the Duke would look at her, or a gardener, the daughter of a disgraced dancing master, and see anything more than a convenient instructor? She was pruning roses with more vigor than necessary when a shadow fell across the garden bed. Looking up, she found Richard standing over her, his expression inscrutable. "Miss Osborne," he said formally, aware of the other gardeners working nearby. "A word, if you please." Winnie followed him to a more secluded part of the garden, her heart pounding. Was this to be her dismissal? Had Lady Rosalind somehow discovered their arrangement and demanded the impertinent servant be removed? You weren't in the conservatory last night, Richard said when they were alone. I thought, with your guests, you wouldn't require my services, Winnie replied, keeping her eyes on the ground. I always require your services, he said, his voice oddly rough. Then, more gently, I missed our lesson. Winnie looked up, startled by the admission. Did you dance with Lady Rosalind? A shadow crossed his face. I did. She complimented my skill and asked where I had learned. I told her I had been practicing alone. As you should have, Winnie said quickly. It wouldn't do for her to know, why not? Richard interrupted. Why should I not acknowledge the person who has helped me overcome a significant limitation? Winnie stared at him, wondering if he truly did not understand. Because I am a servant, my lord. And you are a duke. To admit that you took instruction from someone like me would only add to the gossip. Someone like you, Richard repeated slowly. You mean someone intelligent, patient, skilled, and kind? I mean someone of no consequence, Winnie said, the words bitter on her tongue. Someone whose existence would be beneath the notice of Lady Rosalind and her mother. Not beneath mine, Richard said quietly. Before Winnie could respond, a melodious voice called from the terrace. Your Grace! Mamma was wondering if you might escort us to the village this morning. Lady Rosalind stood framed in the sunlight, a vision in pale blue silk. Richard straightened, the Duke's mask slipping back into place. Of course, Lady Rosalind. I shall join you presently. He turned back to Winnie, conflict evident in his eyes. This evening, he said in a low voice. The conservatory. Please. Winnie nodded, unable to refuse him even as she knew she should. That night, she waited in the conservatory, her hands nervously smoothing her apron. She had taken extra care with her appearance, washing her hair and pinning it more carefully than usual, though she told herself it was merely out of respect for her employer. When Richard entered, he was still dressed in his evening clothes, his cravat slightly loosened. He looked tired but determined. I wasn't sure you would come, he said. You asked me to, Winnie replied simply. Richard paced the length of the conservatory, apparently struggling to find words, an unusual state for a man normally so articulate. Finally, he stopped before her. Lady Harrington has made it clear that she and her daughter are here to secure an engagement, he said bluntly. It seems the Tun has decided that Lady Rosalind would make an appropriate duchess. Winnie's heart sank, though she maintained a calm exterior. She is very beautiful. Yes, Richard agreed. And accomplished, well-connected, and impeccably bred. She plays the pianoforte tolerably well and can discuss the weather with remarkable perseverance. Despite herself, Winnie smiled at the dry assessment. High praise indeed. The highest society can offer. Richard resumed his pacing. Do you know why I came to Thornfield Park, Winnie? The sudden change of subject caught her off guard. To escape the gossip about your dancing. Partly. But more than that, I came because I was failing at being the Duke everyone expected me to be. My brother was the one groomed for this role. He was charming, sociable, comfortable in ballrooms and drawing rooms. I was raised to be the spare, allowed to pursue my studies, my books, my solitary interests. His voice grew bitter. Now I am expected to lead a society I have never understood nor cared for. You've made remarkable progress, Winnie offered. Your dancing is the least of it, Richard interrupted. I've watched my father and brother navigate these waters their entire lives. The marriages of convenience. The political alliances formed over port and cigars. The endless, empty conversations with people who care only for your title, your wealth, your influence. He stopped pacing and faced her directly. I thought I had no choice but to follow their path. And then I met you. Winnie's breath caught in her throat. My lord, you've shown me another way to live, Richard continued, his gaze intense. Your father chose love over position, happiness over society's approval. And from all you've said, he never regretted it. He didn't, Winnie confirmed softly. But my lord, our situations are hardly comparable. You have responsibilities, obligations that my father did not. Do those obligations include sacrificing any chance at genuine happiness? At genuine connection? Richard took a step closer. Lady Rosalind and I spoke for hours today, and not once did she ask what I truly think or feel about anything of consequence. Not once did I see in her eyes what I see in yours when you speak of your father, or the gardens, or when you lose yourself in the music as we dance. And what is that? Winnie asked, barely above a whisper. Life, Richard said simply. Passion. Authenticity. Everything that has been lacking in my existence until now. Hope, dangerous and unbidden, bloomed in Winnie's chest. She fought to suppress it. What are you saying, my lord? I'm saying that I cannot, will not, marry Lady Rosalind, regardless of what society expects. I'm saying that these weeks with you have been the most genuine of my life. I'm saying. He took a deep breath. I'm asking if you might consider a rather unconventional position at Thornfield. Winnie's hope crumbled as quickly as it had formed. A position? You mean, as your? Richard's eyes widened as he realized how his words had been interpreted. No. Good God, no. I meant as my wife, Winnie. The world seemed to stop. Winnie stared at him, certain she had misheard. Your wife. Richard took her hands in his grip warm and steady. I know it's sudden. I know it defies every convention. But I cannot imagine returning to London, to that life, without you by my side. You've taught me more than dancing, Winnie. You've taught me what matters. The scandal would be enormous, Winnie said faintly. A duke marrying a gardener, they would ostracize you. Let them, Richard said fiercely. I have wealth enough to live without their approval. We could divide our time between here and London, fulfill the necessary obligations of my position without sacrificing our happiness. You hardly know me, Winnie protested, though her heart was racing with impossible joy. A few weeks of dance lessons, I know enough, Richard insisted. I know you are kind, intelligent, and brave. I know you speak your mind, even to a duke. His lips curved in a rare, genuine smile. I know that when I'm with you, I feel more myself than I have since my brother died. The rest, we can discover together. Winnie looked into his eyes, earnest, vulnerable, so different from the cold duke who had arrived at Thornfield weeks ago, and knew she could not refuse him, regardless of the consequences. Yes, she said simply. The smile that illuminated Richard's face was worth any scandal that might follow. He drew her into his arms with newfound confidence, and there in the conservatory, surrounded by the exotic blooms they had tended together, the Duke and the gardener danced their first dance as equals. The announcement of the engagement of Richard Thornfield, Duke of Thornfield, to Miss Winifred Osborne, daughter of the late Mr. James Osborne, dancing master, caused precisely the sensation they had anticipated. The Gazette devoted its entire front page to what it called the most unsuitable match since the Prince Regent. Lady Harrington departed Thornfield in a fury, declaring that the Duke must have taken leave of his senses. Several elderly relatives threatened to contest the marriage on grounds of mental incompetence. Richard weathered the storm with unexpected grace, his newfound confidence evident in every public appearance. When questioned directly about his choice at his club, he reportedly replied, I have chosen a woman of character, intelligence, and genuine warmth over one whose only qualification is an accident of birth. If that marks me as insane in the eyes of society, then perhaps society itself is mad. The wedding took place at Thornfield Park in the spring of 1846, attended by only those few friends brave enough to defy convention. The bride wore a gown of simple elegance, carrying a bouquet of rare orchids from the conservatory where she had first taught her husband to dance. And at the wedding breakfast, to the astonishment and eventual delight of their guests, the Duke and his new Duchess performed a waltz of such grace and harmony that even the most skeptical observers were moved. They move as one, remarked one elderly countess who had come prepared to disapprove but found herself charmed instead. Perhaps there is something to be said for marrying a dancing master's daughter after all. In the years that followed, the scandal gradually faded as scandals do. The Duchess of Thornfield's natural dignity, intelligence, and kindness won over all but the most determined critics. Her projects to improve conditions for tenant farmers earned widespread praise. Her gardens at Thornfield became renowned throughout England. And if anyone wondered at the Duke's remarkable transformation from awkward scholar to confident nobleman, they attributed it to the power of love, a force that, in the end, proved stronger than even the most entrenched traditions of English society.